The Mafia boss sat alone at the cafe until a little girl walked up and said, "Are you okay, sir?" His weathered hands stilled around the espresso cup, dark eyes meeting innocent blue ones that showed no fear, only genuine concern for a stranger's frown. For 20 years, Jonathan Hayes had built an empire feared throughout Buffalo, his name whispered in terrified tones by those who crossed his path. Yet here stood this tiny blonde child, barely 3 years old, watching him with a head tilted curiously to one side, as if he were merely another lonely patron needing company. "Becky, no. Come back here right now." A young woman rushed forward, horror etched across her face as she realized her daughter had approached the most dangerous man in the city. Her slender fingers trembled as she scooped up the child, avoiding eye contact with the notorious crime lord. "I'm so sorry for disturbing you," she mumbled, cheeks flushing crimson as she backed away, clutching her daughter protectively against her chest. The faded blue waitress uniform she wore belonged to Rosemary's Cafe, where Jonathan had been taking his morning coffee for the past 5 years, always alone, always feared. Jonathan watched them retreat, something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, as the little girl waved goodbye over her mother's shoulder. He hadn't spoken a word, hadn't needed to. His reputation alone was enough to send most people running, even those who served him daily with practiced, terrified smiles. The woman, Grace according to her name tag, had eyes that matched her daughter's, though hers held exhaustion where the child's sparkled with wonder. Jonathan found himself wondering what circumstances had brought a woman barely in her mid-20s to wait tables while caring for a toddler alone. His bodyguard shifted uncomfortably by the door, unsure how to interpret their boss's unusual interest in the young waitress and her child. They were accustomed to his cold demeanor, the calculated decisions that had built and maintained his criminal enterprise through brutal efficiency. For the first time in years, Jonathan left a tip that made the cafe owner's eyes widen in disbelief. $500 tucked beneath his empty cup. His black Cadillac pulled away from the curb as Grace watched through the window, confusion and wariness battling across her face. 3 days later, he returned at the same hour, choosing the same corner table with its perfect view of both entrances. Strategic positioning had become second nature, after years of watching for rivals and federal agents eager to bring down his operation. Grace served him with quiet efficiency, never meeting his gaze directly as she placed his usual order before him, black espresso and a single almond biscotti. The tension in her shoulders betrayed her nervousness, though she handled the interaction with surprising composure. "Your daughter," Jonathan said suddenly, his voice low and rough from disuse. "She has uncommon courage for one so young." The words surprised even him, unplanned and dangerously revealing of the thoughts that had occupied his mind since their encounter. Grace froze, coffee pot suspended mid-air, as her eyes finally locked with his, searching for the threat she expected to find lurking there. Instead, she saw something that made her pause, a genuine curiosity, perhaps even respect, in the gaze of Buffalo's most feared crime lord. "Becky sees the good in everyone," she replied cautiously, setting down the pot with deliberate care. "I try not to discourage it, even though the world—" She trailed off, leaving unsaid what they both knew, that the world would eventually teach her daughter harder lessons. Little Becky peeked out from behind the counter where she had been coloring, crayon still clutched in her tiny fist as she spotted Jonathan and waved cheerfully. Before her mother could stop her, she toddled over, proudly presenting him with her artwork, a lopsided yellow sun above what might have been people. "It's you," she explained seriously, pointing to a tall stick figure standing apart from the others. "You looked sad, so I gave you friends." The simplicity of her gesture, the casual kindness offered without expectation, struck Jonathan with unexpected force, cracking something long frozen within his chest. Jonathan's lieutenants watched with growing concern as their boss's routine changed over the following weeks, his visits to Rosemary's Cafe becoming longer, more frequent. Ray Donovan, his second in command for 12 years, finally dared to question the wisdom of forming attachments so public, so vulnerable. "The Carmichael family is moving against our territories in North Buffalo," Ray warned, sliding surveillance photos across Jonathan's mahogany desk. "And you're spending mornings watching a waitress and her kid instead of handling business." The implied criticism hung between them, dangerous in its boldness. Jonathan studied the photos without comment, his expression unreadable as he considered the rival family's encroachment on his territory. His empire spanned gambling, protection rackets, and high-interest loans that had financed half of Buffalo's downtown development, territories he had claimed through calculated violence and unwavering resolve. "Have you ever wondered," Jonathan asked quietly, "what it might be like to walk down a street without watching every shadow?" His fingers traced the edge of a report detailing the previous night's collections, numbers that represented both his power and his prison. Ray shifted uncomfortably, loyalty warring with concern for the organization they had built together. "We're not made for normal lives, boss," he replied carefully, watching Jonathan's face for the anger that had historically followed any challenge to his authority or judgment. Instead of rage, Jonathan's expression held something Ray had never witnessed before: contemplation, perhaps even doubt. "The Carmichael situation requires a message," he said finally, rising from his chair with the fluid grace that had earned him the street name, the Ghost, in his younger years. The execution of 2 Carmichael lieutenants that evening restored the expected order, their bodies discovered by the harbor as dawn broke over Lake Erie. Jonathan watched the news report from his penthouse, whiskey untouched in his hand, as the reporter described the city's ongoing gang violence. Despite the swift elimination of the immediate threat, Jonathan found himself increasingly distracted by thoughts of Grace's precarious situation, her struggle to make rent on a waitress's salary, the long hours that left precious little time with her daughter, information his men had quietly gathered at his request. The following Monday, he arrived at the cafe earlier than usual, intercepting Grace as she hurried toward the employee entrance, dark circles beneath her eyes, betraying another sleepless night. "Allow me to walk with you," he said, not quite a question, but lacking his customary demand. Grace hesitated, keys clutched tightly in her palm, as she considered the potential danger against the surprising gentleness he had displayed around Becky. "My landlord's raising the rent again," she said unexpectedly, the words spilling out from exhaustion and frustration. "I don't have time to chat." "I could help with that," Jonathan offered, keeping pace beside her as they rounded the corner toward the cafe's back entrance. The morning light cast long shadows across the alley, highlighting the stark contrast between his tailored suit and her worn coat. Grace stopped abruptly, turning to face him with unexpected fierceness. "I don't take money from men in your line of work," she stated plainly, naming the unspoken reality between them. "Whatever you think you might want from me or my daughter, the answer is no." Jonathan felt an unfamiliar sting at her rejection, at being judged, however accurately, for the life he had built. "Not all assistance comes with strings," he responded, maintaining a careful distance between them, despite his desire to step closer, to somehow prove himself different from her expectations. Behind the cafe, Becky waited with Mrs. Winters, the elderly owner who watched her before opening hours. The child's face brightened at the sight of Jonathan, her innocent delight in his presence another crack in the armor he had spent decades constructing around himself. That evening, as thunder rolled across Buffalo's skyline, Grace discovered an envelope in her locker containing 3 months' advance rent, paid directly to her landlord. No note, no expectations, just financial breathing room she desperately needed. She stood frozen, rainwater dripping from her coat onto the cafe's linoleum floor. Across town, Jonathan sat in his car outside the rundown apartment building where Grace and Becky lived, watching shadows move behind their third-floor window. The neighborhood buzzed with the kind of desperation he had once exploited. Addicts, small-time dealers, people with nowhere else to go. His phone buzzed with updates about the Carmichael family's retreat from contested territory, about shipments arriving at the harbor, about politicians requiring gentle reminders of past favors. The business of power continued its relentless pace while Jonathan remained unusually still, unusually silent. When Grace appeared at his table the following morning, her expression was a complex mixture of gratitude and wariness. "I can't accept charity," she said quietly, sliding a sealed envelope toward him. The money he had paid to her landlord, somehow scraped together despite her limited resources. "It wasn't charity," Jonathan replied, leaving the envelope untouched between them. "Consider it an investment in this cafe's future." The half-truth hung between them, both knowing his interest extended far beyond the struggling business that employed her. Grace studied him with new intensity, searching for hidden motives in his carefully neutral expression. "Why us?" she finally asked, the question that had clearly kept her awake through another night. "Of all the sad stories in Buffalo, why did you notice mine?" Jonathan considered the truth, that her daughter's simple question had pierced defenses built through decades of calculated cruelty, that Grace's determined dignity despite crushing circumstances reminded him of his own mother's struggles long ago. Instead, he offered a different truth. "Because you weren't afraid to see me as a man, not just a reputation." The cafe door chimed as Becky burst in, having escaped Mrs. Winter's watchful eye again, her small sneakers squeaking across the floor as she raced toward their table. "Mr. Jonathan, I drew another picture for you," she announced proudly, climbing onto the chair beside him without hesitation. Grace watched with visible unease as her daughter chatted animatedly with Buffalo's most notorious criminal, describing her preschool adventures with complete trust in her audience. Jonathan listened with genuine attention, asking questions that revealed surprising knowledge about children's development and interests. "Your husband," Jonathan ventured carefully during a lull in Becky's enthusiastic storytelling, observing Grace's bare ring finger but aware that circumstances often complicated relationship statuses. "Is he?" He left the question open-ended, allowing her to interpret his inquiry as she chose. "He left when I told him I was pregnant," Grace answered matter-of-factly, no bitterness coloring her tone as she wiped down a nearby table. "Said he wasn't ready for responsibility, then blocked my number." The simple statement revealed volumes about the strength she had developed through necessity. Jonathan felt an unfamiliar surge of protective anger, quickly suppressed beneath his customary calm. "Men who abandon their responsibilities rarely find success in this city," he observed neutrally, the implied threat subtle enough that Grace chose to ignore it, changing the subject with practiced ease. As weeks passed, their morning conversations extended beyond polite small talk, revealing the vast differences in their life experiences while highlighting unexpected commonalities, both raised by single mothers, both familiar with hunger's sharp edge in childhood, both protective of those few they allowed close. Grace began sharing her dream of opening a small bookstore cafe where Becky could play while she worked, a safe space filled with stories and possibilities rather than the constant hustle of the diner. Jonathan listened, mentally calculating the capital required, the potential locations, the steps needed to transform her wishful thinking into reality. "You should come to dinner," Grace suggested suddenly one rainy Tuesday, surprising herself as much as Jonathan with the invitation. "Nothing fancy, just spaghetti and meatballs." Becky's been asking when her tall friend might visit. The normality of the offer stood in stark contrast to the complex reality of their developing connection. Jonathan arrived at Grace's apartment that Friday evening, feeling strangely nervous as he stood before her door with a bottle of sparkling cider. The security detail he'd stationed discreetly throughout the building felt both necessary and intrusive for what was supposed to be a simple dinner. Grace opened the door wearing jeans and a soft blue sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in her usual practical ponytail. The small apartment behind her smelled of garlic and tomato sauce, warm and inviting despite the peeling paint. Becky launched herself at him immediately, wrapping tiny arms around his legs with complete trust that still stunned him. "I showed everyone your picture at school today," she announced proudly, leading him by the hand to a refrigerator decorated with childish artwork. "You're different with her," Grace observed quietly as they stood side by side in her cramped kitchen, preparing salad while pasta bubbled on the ancient stove. "Gentler than I imagined someone in your position could be." As autumn deepened into October, their Sunday afternoons in Delaware Park became a ritual, Becky feeding ducks by the lake while Jonathan and Grace sat on a nearby bench. They gradually shared pieces of themselves that no one else had been trusted to hear. "My mother worked 3 jobs, Jonathan confessed during one such afternoon, watching fallen leaves spiral toward the lake's surface. "She died believing I'd become a lawyer, her one success story making it out of poverty through legitimate means." Grace's hand found his between them on the bench, her fingers cool against his palm as she offered connection without demanding further explanation. "We all disappoint the people who believe in us," she replied softly, her gaze following Becky's delighted chase after a squirrel. Halloween brought unexpected joy as Jonathan found himself holding a tiny princess's hand while she collected candy throughout the small neighborhood festival. Parents whispered behind their hands at his presence, but none dared object when Becky proudly introduced him. "She needs male role models," Grace admitted later that evening as they watched Becky sort her candy haul on the living room carpet. "I just never expected it might be you." The statement hung between them, acknowledging their unusual relationship. November wines brought the first snow flurries and a subtle shift in their dynamic as Jonathan began sharing dinners at Grace's apartment 3 nights a week. His guards remained outside, increasingly confused by their boss's extended absences from his usual haunts. Ray confronted him after a particularly lengthy disappearance, concern evident beneath his professional deference. "The Mosconi family is asking questions about your change in routine," he warned. "They're wondering if you're distracted, vulnerable, planning something." Jonathan studied the intelligence report with practiced detachment, weighing the growing threat against his desire to continue this unexpected connection with Grace and Becky. Perhaps it's time we reminded everyone exactly why Buffalo has remained peaceful these past 5 years. That evening, as snowflakes drifted past Grace's kitchen window, Jonathan helped Becky with her alphabet practice, his large hands guiding her small ones. The domesticity of the moment struck him with painful clarity. This borrowed peace couldn't last forever. "You're troubled tonight," Grace observed after Becky was tucked into bed, her storybook request for 3 readings finally satisfied. Grace curled beside him on the worn sofa, her presence a comfort he hadn't known he needed until it was offered. The first kiss happened then, gentle and questioning in the soft lamplight of her modest living room. Jonathan's hand cradled her face with unexpected tenderness, the calluses on his fingers testament to a life vastly different from this quiet moment of connection. December arrived with mounting tension as Ray reported increased surveillance from both rival families and federal agents who had noted Jonathan's changed patterns. "They're following the waitress now," Ray stated bluntly during their weekly security briefing. "Someone leaked information about your involvement." Jonathan felt cold rage wash through him, his expression hardening into the mask that had earned him both respect and fear throughout his organization. "Find the source," he commanded, voice dangerously quiet as he studied the surveillance photos of Grace walking Becky to preschool. The slip into possessive language wasn't lost on Ray, whose loyalty to Jonathan warred with concern for the organization they had spent decades building together. "Boss, whatever this is," he gestured toward the photos, "it creates vulnerability that others will exploit." Christmas lights twinkled throughout the city as Jonathan increased security around Grace and Becky, while maintaining his distance for 3 painful days. The time was spent eliminating the information leak that had placed them in danger, a young lieutenant hoping to curry rival favor. Grace noticed his absence immediately, texting with increasing concern until he finally responded with careful neutrality, claiming business demands required his attention. The half-truth tasted bitter as he watched her apartment from his car, ensuring her safety while denying himself her company. When he finally returned to Rosemary's Cafe, Grace pulled him into the storage room, fear and anger battling in her expression. "3 men have been watching our apartment," she hissed, fingers digging into his arm. "Black SUV, tinted windows. This is your world finding us, isn't it?" He couldn't lie to her, not when Becky's safety hung in the balance of truth between them. "Yes," he admitted, maintaining careful space between them despite his desire to pull her close. To promise protection he wasn't certain he could guarantee. "But they won't be a problem anymore." Grace stepped back, really seeing him for the first time since that innocent question from her daughter had cracked his carefully constructed facade. "You killed someone," she whispered, the statement requiring no confirmation as she read the truth in his unchanged expression. "Because of us. I've killed many people," Jonathan replied with brutal honesty, refusing to soften the reality of who he was, of the empire built on violence and fear. "But I've never had something worth protecting before, someone worth changing for." Their fragile peace fractured but didn't break completely, as Grace processed this confirmation of what she had always known, but allowed herself to forget. "I need time," she finally said, returning to the cafe floor without waiting for his response. The Christmas Eve invitation came unexpectedly 3 days later, a simple text message requesting his presence for Becky's sake, regardless of the complications between them. Jonathan arrived bearing carefully chosen gifts, uncertainty tempering his usual confidence as Grace opened the door. Becky's delight at his return eased some tension, as she proudly showed him the small tree decorated with homemade ornaments, chattering about Santa's imminent arrival. Her innocence provided temporary sanctuary from the growing storm around them. Later that night, after Becky had finally succumbed to sleep despite her determination to catch Santa in the act, Grace and Jonathan sat in companionable silence before the twinkling tree. "I know who you are," she said finally, voice steady, despite the weight of her words. Jonathan met her gaze directly, offering neither excuses nor promises he couldn't keep. "The question is whether who I've been matters more than who I'm trying to become," he responded, laying his heart bare in a way he had never risked before with anyone. Grace's answer came in the form of her hand finding his between them on the sofa, fingers interlacing with deliberate choice. "Becky sees something in you worth believing in," she whispered, the Christmas lights casting colored shadows across her face. "I'm choosing to trust her judgment." January brought heavy snow and heavier decisions as Jonathan weighed options that had never before seemed viable. Retirement, legitimate business ventures, perhaps even a life beyond Buffalo. Ray watched this internal struggle with growing alarm, loyalty warring with ambition. The council meeting can't be postponed again, Ray insisted one evening, interrupting Jonathan's review of property listings in coastal Maine. Small towns where Grace's bookstore dream might flourish. 3 families are questioning your leadership, your commitment. Jonathan attended the meeting with cold precision, reasserting dominance through calculated intimidation and strategic concessions that maintained the delicate power balance. No one dared mention his personal entanglements directly, though whispers followed him nonetheless. The morning news reported a warehouse fire at the harbor, Moscone territory, with 3 casualties among the rival family's lower ranks. Jonathan watched Grace's face as she processed the report, her eyes finding his across the cafe with new understanding of the violence he still employed. "We need to talk about the future," Grace said that evening after Becky was asleep, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "About what happened at the harbor, about what keeps happening while we pretend we can have normal Sunday afternoons." Jonathan stood by her apartment window, watching his men patrol the perimeter of the building, a necessary precaution since the intelligence leak had been discovered. "I'm trying to find a way out," he admitted, the words foreign on his tongue after decades of building his empire. "There is no way out," Grace countered, her practical nature cutting through his uncharacteristic optimism. "Not while maintaining control of what you've built. Your world doesn't allow for peaceful retirement, Jonathan. We both know that." The truth hung between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to face, that their growing relationship endangered not only his power, but their very lives. "I can protect you," Jonathan insisted, crossing the room to take her hands in his, needing her to believe him. "At what cost?" Grace asked quietly, her eyes searching his for answers he couldn't provide. "How many more warehouse fires? How many more bodies before someone decides to strike directly at what you care about instead of your business interests?" The question lanced through him like a physical wound. The vulnerability he'd allowed himself by caring for Grace and Becky suddenly laid bare. "I would burn this city to the ground before I let anyone touch you," he promised, the truth of it terrifying them both. Grace pulled away, arms wrapping around herself as she created distance between them. "And that's exactly why this can't continue," she whispered, tears gathering despite her evident resolve. "I won't raise my daughter in the shadow of that kind of violence, even for love." The word hung between them, love, neither having dared speak it aloud until this moment of impending separation. Jonathan felt it like a physical blow, the recognition of what he'd found coinciding perfectly with the realization he would need to surrender it to keep them safe. 1 month, he said finally, the strategist in him already formulating plans, contingencies, escape routes. "Give me 1 month to dismantle what needs dismantling, to ensure no one follows when you leave Buffalo. Then you'll never see me again." Grace's sob caught in her throat, the finality of his decision both exactly what she'd asked for and nothing she wanted. "Becky will be devastated," she managed, the unspoken addition that she would be equally broken hanging silently between them. Jonathan crossed to her then, gathering her against his chest as he pressed his lips to her hair, memorizing the scent of her shampoo, the feeling of her heartbeat against his. "I need you alive and safe more than I need you with me," he whispered, the hardest truth he'd ever spoken. The carefully orchestrated exit plan proceeded with military precision as Jonathan liquidated assets, transferred ownership of legitimate businesses, and prepared documentation for Grace and Becky's new identities. February's bitter cold matched the ruthless efficiency with which he dismantled 20 years of criminal enterprise. Ray's suspicions grew with each passing day, his loyalty increasingly strained by Jonathan's unexplained decisions and secretive phone calls. "The Carmichael family is moving into the void you're creating," he reported during a tense meeting, "and the Moscones are watching the waitresses building around the clock." Jonathan doubled Grace's security detail, instructing his most trusted men to prepare for immediate extraction if necessary, while maintaining enough distance to avoid drawing attention. The countdown to their departure, 3 weeks, then 2, then 10 days, felt both agonizingly slow and terrifyingly swift. Grace packed quietly at night after Becky was asleep, selecting only essentials that could fit in 2 suitcases, photographs and keepsakes of their life in Buffalo. New birth certificates and social security cards waited in a sealed envelope beneath her mattress, escape routes memorized. The betrayal came not from a rival family, but from within, as Ray finally pieced together Jonathan's exit strategy and the role Grace played in it. "You're walking away," he confronted Jonathan in his penthouse office, disbelief hardening into something darker. "Throwing away everything we built for a waitress?" Jonathan neither confirmed nor denied the accusation, years of practice keeping his expression unreadable as he assessed the threat level Ray now presented. "Go home, Ray," he said finally, turning back to the documents on his desk. "We'll discuss this tomorrow when you're thinking clearly." The warning call came at 2:17 a.m. One of Jonathan's guards reporting Ray's meeting with a Moscone lieutenant at an abandoned waterfront property. Jonathan was already moving, gun secured at his back as he called Grace's phone repeatedly, each unanswered ring accelerating his heartbeat. The apartment door hung open when he arrived, furniture overturned, and Grace's careful packing scattered across the floor in clear signs of struggle. Becky's small pink backpack lay abandoned by the door, the stuffed rabbit Jonathan had given her for Christmas still clutched in its straps. Ray took them to the old grain elevator on Michigan Avenue, his driver reported after a flurry of calls to informants throughout the city. "Moscone's men are there too. It's a setup, boss. They're waiting for you to come alone." Jonathan stood motionless in the ransacked apartment, years of tactical thinking crystallizing into absolute clarity as he picked up Becky's stuffed rabbit. "Tell everyone who's still loyal to meet at warehouse 3 in 30 minutes. Full arsenal. No questions asked." While his remaining men gathered, Jonathan accessed the hidden safe in his office, retrieving not just weapons, but a flash drive containing evidence of political corruption reaching the highest levels of Buffalo's government. Insurance he'd hoped never to need, leverage he'd now use without hesitation. A call to the FBI agent who'd been investigating him for years was answered on the first ring. Jonathan's offer simple and non-negotiable. "I'll give you everyone. Records, accounts, names. In return, you ensure the safety of a woman and her daughter who were kidnapped tonight." Snow fell heavily as Jonathan approached the abandoned grain elevator alone, exactly as Ray had demanded. Though 20 federal agents and his loyal lieutenants now surrounded the perimeter, the massive concrete structure loomed against the night sky, windows broken like missing teeth. Inside, Ray waited with 4 Moscone soldiers. Grace and Becky held at gunpoint near the rusted machinery that had once processed Buffalo's agricultural bounty. Becky's terrified whimpers echoed in the cavernous space, Grace's protective arms wrapped tightly around her daughter despite her own fear. "You could have handed over control properly," Ray said as Jonathan entered the circular kill zone they had prepared, multiple weapons trained on his position. "Instead, you decided to run away with them. 20 years of brotherhood thrown away for what? Playing house with a ready-made family?" Jonathan raised his hands slowly, eyes locked on Grace's as he assessed the situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through decades of violence. "Let them walk out of here, Ray. This is between you and me, not them." "Their leverage," Ray countered, gesturing for one of the Moscone men to drag Grace and Becky closer. "Insurance that you'll transfer all accounts and territories properly before we put a bullet in your head. The girl and her mother are just collateral damage in this business transaction." Jonathan felt rather than heard the FBI positioning outside, their communication devices creating subtle electronic interference that only someone expecting them would notice. "You always were smart about strategy, Ray, but missed the bigger picture. I taught you better." Jonathan's gaze shifted momentarily to Becky, her tear-stained face bringing a clarity he'd never experienced in years of life-or-death negotiations. In this moment, all his power, all his wealth, meant nothing compared to the trust in those innocent eyes that had once asked if he was okay. "You taught me that weakness gets you killed," Ray spat, nodding to one of his men who pressed his gun harder against Grace's temple. "That woman made you weak, made you forget who you are, what we built together when nobody believed in us." Blood from a cut above Jonathan's eye trickled down his face as he calculated distances, angles, reaction times, the mathematics of survival he'd mastered long ago. His right hand twitched imperceptibly toward the secondary weapon hidden at his ankle, a movement so subtle only someone trained by him would notice. Ray's laugh echoed harshly through the abandoned structure, genuine amusement mixing with bitterness. "The bigger picture? You mean the family you pretended we were? The loyalty you abandoned the minute some kid asked if you were okay? The bigger picture is knowing when the game is over," Jonathan replied calmly, his gaze never leaving Grace's terrified eyes as he subtly signaled her to be ready. "When to cash out your chips and walk away before you lose everything." A flashbang grenade crashed through the window behind Ray, the explosion of light and sound providing the distraction Jonathan needed to launch himself toward Grace and Becky, shielding them with his body as federal agents stormed the building from multiple entrances simultaneously. Gunfire erupted as the Moscone men engaged with the FBI tactical team, bullets ricocheting off ancient machinery while Jonathan dragged Grace and Becky behind a concrete pillar. "Stay down," he commanded, pulling his weapon as Ray disappeared into the shadows of the massive structure. "Jonathan Hayes, you're under arrest," an FBI agent shouted through the chaos, clearly recognizing the crime boss despite the operation's unusual parameters. "Put down your weapon and put your hands where I can see them." "Get them out first," Jonathan called back, nodding toward Grace and Becky while keeping his gun trained on the darkness where Ray had vanished. "That was our deal, Agent Bryce. They leave safely, then I surrender." Two agents moved forward cautiously to escort Grace and Becky toward the exit, the little girl sobbing uncontrollably as she reached back toward Jonathan. "Don't leave him," she cried, her innocent understanding of the situation breaking something irreparable in Jonathan's heart. A single shot rang out from the shadows, the bullet missing Jonathan by inches as Ray made a final desperate attempt at revenge. "If I'm going down, you're coming with me," Ray's voice echoed, the betrayal in it absolute, as he moved between the massive grain silos. Jonathan pushed Grace toward the FBI agents, his decision made in the fraction of a second between heartbeats. "Take care of our girl," he whispered, brushing his lips against her temple before turning back toward the darkness where his former lieutenant waited. The final confrontation happened in the silent center of the grain elevator, two men who had built an empire together now facing each other with nothing left to lose. "You could have had everything," Ray said, blood from a wound received during the FBI entry staining his shirt. "I already found something better," Jonathan replied simply, lowering his weapon in a gesture that confused Ray momentarily. "Something real. That's why I win even if I lose everything else tonight." The bullet that ended Ray's life came not from Jonathan, but from an FBI sniper positioned in the rafters, the clean shot dropping him instantly as agents swarmed the area. Jonathan placed his gun on the ground and knelt with his hands behind his head, his empire crumbling around him. 3 years passed before Jonathan Hayes saw daylight as a free man, his unprecedented cooperation with federal authorities resulting in reduced sentences and witness protection, rather than the lifetime imprisonment he had expected. The spring sunshine felt foreign on his face as he exited the minimum security facility. A nondescript sedan waited at the prison gates, a federal marshal holding the door without comment as Jonathan slid into the back seat. "Where are we going?" he asked, the civilian clothes they'd provided still stiff and unfamiliar after years in prison uniforms. "Coastal Maine," the marshal replied, passing a sealed envelope containing new identification, credit cards, and a deed to a small property near the ocean. "New name, new start. The deal you made is complete. Everyone who might have recognized you is either dead or in prison." The small coastal town appeared on the horizon after hours of driving, white clapboard houses and fishing boats creating a picture so removed from Buffalo's urban landscape that it seemed almost unreal. Jonathan felt his heartbeat accelerate as they turned down a tree-lined lane toward the shore. A small blue house sat nestled among pine trees at the end of the road, wildflowers growing alongside a winding path to the front door. The marshal pulled to a stop, nodding toward the house without further explanation, as Jonathan slowly exited the vehicle. He stood frozen on the gravel driveway, uncertainty replacing the confidence that had defined him for decades as the front door opened slowly. Grace stepped onto the porch, 3 years older but somehow more beautiful than his memory had preserved, her eyes cautious but welcoming. "Are you really here to stay this time?" she asked, the question carrying the weight of years spent wondering, waiting, rebuilding a life from the fragments left after that night at the grain elevator. Her fingers twisted nervously in the fabric of her sweater as she waited for his answer. "If you'll have me," Jonathan replied simply, remaining where he stood, giving her the space and power to decide whether the sacrifices he'd made were enough to earn a place in the life she'd created here. "I have nothing left to give except myself. No power, no empire. Just me." From behind Grace's legs, a small face appeared. Becky, now 6 years old, her blonde hair longer, but her curious expression unchanged as she studied the stranger on their driveway. "Mom, is that him? The man from your stories?" A small bookstore cat darted between Becky's legs, a ginger tabby with curious eyes that assessed Jonathan with feline indifference before deciding he was worthy of approach. "That's Mr. Whiskers," Becky explained seriously, as if introducing two important friends. "He protects our books." Jonathan noticed the faint scar along Grace's wrist, a reminder of that terrible night at the grain elevator when she'd fought to protect her daughter, despite impossible odds. The wound had healed, but the mark remained, much like the invisible scars they all carried from their time in Buffalo. Behind them, the marshal's car pulled away silently, removing the last official connection to his former life, as the government kept its end of the bargain that had saved dozens from prison and put key evidence in federal hands. Jonathan watched it disappear around the bend, the final chain broken. Grace nodded, tears gathering as she placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart, that's Jonathan, the one who made sure we found our happy ending, even when it seemed impossible." Her eyes never left his face as she spoke, searching for the man she had fallen in love with beneath the changes prison had wrought. Recognition dawned in Becky's eyes as she stepped forward, studying him with the directness that had first cracked his defenses years ago in a Buffalo cafe. "You look sad again," she observed, head tilting to one side. "Are you okay, sir?" The echo of their first meeting broke something open in Jonathan's chest, tears falling freely as he knelt to meet her at eye level. "I'm much better now, seeing you both," he answered honestly, offering his hand to the child who had unknowingly changed the course of his life. Becky bypassed his outstretched hand and threw her arms around his neck instead. The unconditional acceptance of a child who had been told stories of his sacrifice rather than his crimes. "Mom said you'd come find us when you could. She made me wait a really long time." Jonathan looked up at Grace over Becky's shoulder, the question in his eyes answered as she moved down the porch steps toward them, her own tears falling unchecked. "I never stopped believing you'd find your way back to us," she whispered, joining their embrace on the sun-dappled driveway. Behind the blue house, the ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, waves crashing against rocky shores with rhythmic certainty. The small bookstore cafe in town bore Grace's name on a hand-painted sign, the dream she'd shared with him in whispered conversations now a reality. Their story had begun with an innocent question from a child who saw past a fearsome reputation to the loneliness beneath. It continued now in this peaceful place, far from the violence and power that had defined Jonathan's former life, with the family he had sacrificed everything to protect. "Welcome home," Grace whispered against his lips, as Becky tugged them both toward the house, eager to show Jonathan her room, her books, the life they had built while waiting for him. "We saved a place for you, just in case miracles really do happen. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments where you're watching this story from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video, because your support is important for me to continue here.